for me to not only the way I've experienced grace in my own life, but what I really think is true about young people and the church in North America right now, which is I think that if God's church in our country has any hope of um, being a church in love with Jesus, who are making disciples of Jesus, who are telling anybody who will listen about the gospel, the church must be a church who is no longer afraid of secularity. And that's really where I'm going with this, my remarks for today. It's precisely in secular life that Christian churches in this country are afraid to go to. Maybe not all, I'm speaking generally, of course, but it seems to me that our relationship to secularity as Christians in this country is not a critical relationship. It's not a relationship that desires its transformation. It's not a relationship that desires its good, but it's a relationship of fear in which the secular is this space where sin happens, where the slow erosion of the church's influence takes place, where people and the world get lost. And so rather than seeing the secular as a place that is already under the dominion of Jesus Christ, which I just think is true. I think that I can't think of a realm in which Christ does not touch. Rather than see the secular realm in that way, many churches in North America instead see the secular as the enemy. And I think that it's in fact the church's fear of the secular that is partially what has driven so much of North American Christianity into the arms of the powers of this world, which is really, I think, where I want to try to come at with this question of young people in the church. Where are the young people? What's going on? Well, the majority of the young people that the church supposedly loves are in secular spaces. So I'll start with that. As I said in the beginning, the kinds of young people that, if the mainline are good at connecting with, they are only good at connecting with those young people who already have a foot outside of the secular space. And I'm sorry, friends, but we can't. The Christian church can't compete over the same small group of people. That's actually not reaching people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's actually not creating more disciples. Instead, it either sucks young people who have already heard the gospel into a church culture war, or it repels folks who have already heard the gospel because they don't want anything to do with that. And instead, we must begin to see secularity not as a place of fear, but instead as the place where God's lordship is already expressed, even if it's expressed in a way that's different than the church. And we must be able to be in those spaces with love. I want to go back, or I want to go forward a little bit to just talk about this aspect. I think it's because of the church's fear of secularity, as I said, that the church has driven itself into the arms of political and social cultural power. And I see this, and I said this to Dr. Carnegie last week, I see this phenomenon as an unmitigated catastrophe. I can't think of a worse thing, if I was totally honest with you, that the church could do than decide that it's going to pair itself with social, cultural, and political and economic power, particularly the power of the right. At this point in our history, that's what we're seeing, right? I think it's a theological catastrophe, one, because it demonstrates a deep idolatry. I think it demonstrates absolutely shameful discipleship. Remember, what you win them with, you win them to. If you win people to your church on the back of fear of transformed culture, on the back of even the desire to end abortion in this country. If you win people on cultural, political, and social and economic issues, that's what you win them to. You win them to those issues. You don't win them to the gospel. Um, that's why I see it as shameful discipleship. I also see this as a spiritual decay that causes the church to mistake Pilate for Jesus of Nazareth. I can repeat that if you want. I think that the Christian church in this country's drift towards and marriage with political power causes us to see not the crucified carpenter, but Pontius Pilate as really the one that we need to be emulating, the one that can control legislation, the one that can control culture, the one that could put a kibosh on dissent. The crucified carpenter is the one we are to be modeled after, not Pilate. And so it's a spiritual malaise, a disease. I also see this as an unmitigated catastrophe for the very young people that the church is called to reach, because it frames any young person or any person who is outside of this order, who is outside of the kind of immediate Christian nationalist or Christo-fascist or order as the enemy. And this is about anybody, but this is primarily about young people. Forgive me, I don't terribly care what anybody thinks about, say, transgendered young people. But the moment young people, transgendered or not, are viewed as the enemy of the church, that because they live in this sort of secularity, right? They're transgender, they're a part of this world order that's not connected to God's kingdom order. The moment we cast young people as the enemy because they are outside of our immediate vision of social and political orders, we are already committing a sin that is sort of beyond what we can imagine. Those who lead young people astray, it's best to tie a millstone around their neck and plunge themselves into the river Jordan. That particular teaching from Jesus was not a teaching towards the secular authorities. It was a teaching to the religious people that were around him, to consider young people as being enemies of the faith precisely because of their connection to the secular order is a bad thing. And as I said, I think it's an unmitigated catastrophe. I think it's a total catastrophe. Why? So in light of all of this, I actually do not have a terribly positive outlook. Over the last several months, in my prayer life and in my theology and meditative life, I find myself really focused on judgment, in this category of God's judgment upon the church and upon Christians and upon the world. And I cannot help but think that the Christian church's marriage to power and politics and its declaration of the secular as the enemy, I cannot help but think that this is irreversible, that this is simply a matter of we just have to let God's judgment continue to judge the church. I don't think it's salvageable, if I was honest with you. I don't think I think that we can hire the best PR reps in the world to try to tell the folks outside of the church, don't worry, we're not that kind of a church. We can have somebody pay them to say that as much as we want, but I think the damage is done. And I think that right now, the life of God's church in this country might be one of radical judgment, one that we just need to submit to. In the meantime, while we're submitting to this judgment, I think that we need to dismantle, if I may, And when I say we need to dismantle, I think we need to reimagine what God's church looks like. And everybody always says that, right? We need to reimagine what God's church looks like. But when I'd say about reimagining, what I really mean is I think we just need to be a secular church. All I mean by that is not we need to be no longer critical of secularity, or that we need to find ourselves submitting even more strongly to the powers of the world. It's not what I mean at all. Instead, what I mean is we continue to recognize that it's precisely outside of the kind of fabricated church world that so many North American churches have created, or so many North American churches have strengthened by being married to political power. It's precisely outside of those spaces that many of us, so many of us, millennials, Gen Zers, and younger, have experienced God's grace. When I experienced God's grace with Dr. Kaneki in his house, yes, I was among one of God's people. I was in a house of a believer, but I was in a house. I was not in a church. I was not sitting around, at a Bible study. I wasn't. Instead, I got to experience the grace of God outside of all of that, simply because somebody who God has called was faithful. And that faithfulness we must be able to have in secular spaces. Not to destroy secularity, not to do anything like that, but instead to continue to show the world and us that in the secular space where we find so many people who have never heard the gospel, Jesus is already walking. Jesus is already a part of that space. Jesus is already drawn alongside of those people in those spaces, and we must go there too. And I think we need to go there precisely because it's currently in North American church culture, North American church, in North American church world, we are in a place where judgment is upon us, and we can't escape that judgment. And so, long story short, friends, what is the relationship to young people and God's church in this country? Well, right now, pretty darn bad. And I think that currently, I don't know if we can fix it. But what we can do is be God's people alongside of young people, and be a mobile church rather than a fixed denomination or a fixed institution, and to be a kind of maybe a kind of field hospital, where we find ourselves in and among people whom the gospel and the church holds no sway at all. That's what I got.
Ethan, thank you. I'd like to have a little dialogue with you, and then I'm going to open it up.
Sure.
My blog post this morning and my podcast quotes John Calvin, who says, "The church is nothing more than a series of resurrections from the dead." And one of the things that struck me is, before the resurrection, we've got to recognize that we're dead. And so another way of saying it is the church is nothing more than a series of being dead, a series of dead experiences of death, after which we see a resurrection. So I think you are in line with, I think you're on solid ground. Of course, this has been my thesis for several years, but the part of it is that God does this. Luther describes this in Isaiah 28 as God's alien work. God does what is foreign to God, even at times, out of the sovereignty of God. God takes God's people into judgment, even though that seems foreign and alien to who God is. And I hear that line throughout what you're saying. I'm going to open it up. I've got number of other questions, but I want to open up to others to just have a dialogue with Ethan about what you shared. Thank you, Ethan. Anyone want to respond or questions for Ethan?
Yeah, Ethan, first of all, thanks for this morning. I don't think you're a pessimist at all. I think you're a realist, and I think you're calling it the way that it is. And I think there's a lot of scriptural support for what you say. I would draw our attention to Mark chapter 8, where you have two situations. You have the one where Jesus heals the blind man, and in two stages. The first one he sees, but he sees men walking and they look like trees, right? And then he heals them and he has better sight. And I think Mark is drawing our attention to our first encounters with Jesus. We may not clearly understand what he's teaching us, right? And then that's followed up by that example with Peter, where Jesus asks him, "Who do you say I am?" And he says, "You're the Messiah," right? So he gets that right. And then when Jesus begins to tell him that the way of following him is the cross, right? He's going to follow that up later and say you have to take up your own cross, but he's going to say the way of the Messiah is through the cross and suffering. And Peter says, "Oh, no, that's not going to happen." And what is Jesus? It's a rebuke. He says, "Get thee behind me, Satan," right? I think there's a lot that I've thought about that passage a lot this week, and I think there's a lot that we can draw from it. And one of them is, just because we are Christians does not mean that we fully understand God's will or his call in our lives, right? We are all at various stages of seeing what Jesus wants us to do. And we all have, unfortunately, blind spots. And that's true as individuals, and that's true as nations. Peter, his temptation is to power, right? You're not going to become the leader through weakness and through the cross. No, Jesus, you've got this misunderstood. It's going to be power. And I think that's an important point for us to remember, is that there is a real temptation for Christians to think that God's kingdom will come about through their own efforts or through power, through politics. And I think the blind spot for American Christians is Christian nationalism. And we're not the first ones. I mean, the English, the Germans, the Italians. In fact, you go back and look at Robert Paxton's Anatomy of Fascism, and you can make a pretty good argument that every single instance of dismantlement of democracy has come about because of the influence of the Christians within that society, who at least acquiesced and in many cases facilitated it. So I think what you're saying is exactly right. I think we have blind spots. And I am absolutely convinced from reading scripture that there are only two ways that God's people return to him. And one is through a return to the scriptures, as we saw with who was the king that Hezekiah, was it, that rediscovered the scriptures and the people repented. And the other one is crushing persecution. God sends somebody like the Assyrians or the Babylonians. But I think you're exactly right. I think we are being judged. I think this is God's rebuke, and I think that we're being rebuked in a lot of ways. I think that we're being rebuked through the way that our society has treated people of color, right? I think that this fight over critical race theory, I think that Christian nationalism, I think a lot of these are ways in which God is trying to bring us back, and he will, one way or the other, bring us back to the teachings of Christ. So I think you've set the table. And my question that I've been wrestling with for the last 2 years, if not longer, is what's my role as a Christian, right? I have 3 children, married, I have some grandchildren. And I think that one of the things that I can do is try and build bridges and have relationships with them and with their friends, instead of inviting them to church, right? But I mean, all 3 of my children are Christians. They're part of Christian homes, but they're struggling with the church now too. And what do they do? And I think it just comes down to this: love God, love others, right? I think we're called to love, and I think that unfortunately, if we try and do that within the structure of the church, we're just going to be sitting with other people who listen to Fox News or whatever particular news source they listen to, and we are not going to be loving the people in our society. And so I think you're exactly right. I think the kingdom of God is going to call. I think we're being called to step outside of the American structure of the church and participate in the society by loving God and loving others. Sorry, that's a lot.
I really appreciate that, John. I just to say another thing along with what you're saying. For me, I really see God's judgment and our hopefully our call as Christian people to resist the powers of evil and struggle against the powers of this world as primarily a discipleship and a sanctification issue, right? As a pastor, I have no problem being political. In general, and by political, all I mean is I have no problem speaking about political things and demanding that we as Christian people look upon political things as opportunities for God's, grace. But I often tell my congregants, when we talk about racism, when we talk about sexism, when we talk about many of the other isms, right? There's the reason why we talk about them as Christians isn't because we need to decide what kind of political Christian we're going to be. It isn't about, are we going to be a right-wing political Christian, or are we going to be a left-wing political Christian? Well, no, it's about, this is what Christian discipleship is. Christian discipleship has everything to do with the way in which love has been shed abroad in our hearts for all people. And if there's a sense, if we ever encounter a group of people that for some reason we struggle to have love shed abroad in our hearts over, we must interrogate that as Christians, not so that we can be really great political actors, but so that we can be great Christians. We have to be able to interrogate that. Which is why we have to attack racism in our hearts and in our churches and in our world. Why? Well, because racism is demonic, and it's demonic in precisely the fact that it blinds us to love. We simply cannot love well when we are under the influence of racism. And that's the case of all of the powers of the world, right? And so thank you for that, John.
Can I go?
Yeah, go ahead, Tracy.
Yeah. Ethan, on your pessimism. I wonder if what you think of this narrative, Ethan,
Mm-hmm.
That, you use the word judgment, that we're under it. The evangelical, whatever, the whole church, the evangelical church, whatever, is under it. And I'm tempted to say something more like this, that the church has been under it, okay? Insofar as judgment involves blindness, God giving people over to sin, that kind of thing, right? But what I see happening, along with judgment in some cases, is a kind of an awakening happening. A group like this getting together, just more and more across the country, people are waking up to their cultural captivity. I am one of those people. So is John Mitchell down there. He and I are buds, so we're kind of in tandem here. I'm not saying there's no judgment happening, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of positivity. I would say this podcast that Conrad puts on is an example. Lots of books are being published. Esau Macaulay's stuff, and a lot of white Christians and so on are really having their eyes open. You're seeing it a lot of places, it seems to me. So I'm wondering if we just shift the timeline here, that we're really right now. In other words, I think we've been at it, and for me personally, and I think a lot of people, COVID is what did it. And our church's responses to COVID, especially when you live in red counties. I live in a red county, very red county in California. To give you a sense of where I live, do you know who Kevin J. McCarthy is? He is the Republican leader in the House. That's my congressman, and he does not have to campaign around here. He's going to win automatically 60%. It's a landslide red county. When you live in that environment, believe me, you have a very different response to COVID. And I literally thought I was going to lose my job, because if we were going to wear the mask, we were going to do this and that and so on. And we did. But when I saw those responses, I was already instinctually, something's wrong here. There's too much political captivity here. There's too much alignment with the right. And then that just burst open for me. And since then, I've read a ton. I'm not alone. In my area, there's few of us. You got to kind of be in secret a little bit, but there's more and more people. So all I'm saying, there's some positive stuff going on, Ethan. How would you respond to my general observation?
I think that's true, Tracy. I do. I think that, it's always good to see folks, waking up, as you say, or folks really engaging, maybe even for the first time in a form of Christian discipleship that really takes stock of what is happening, in our world in this way. I'm not here to deny that. I think for me, though, the question of the institutional Christian church and its flirtation and marriage with power is still not being judged, right? Or it's still being judged. The judgment is not concluded. And it is good and faithful for good and faithful followers of Jesus to wake up and organize and attempt to mitigate as best they can, and attempt to once again be faithful and repent. And I think that's very good. However, my pessimism, or my realism, however we want to put it, I think stems primarily from the reality of my baptism. Even though I can be faithful as best as I can, under God's grace, I can be as faithful as possible. In light of my baptism, I am bound, inextricably bound to all other baptized people. My judgment is their judgment. This is part of my theology of baptism. This might be up for debate, but I'll fight you on it. And because of that, because of my solidarity with Madison Cawthorn, or because of my solidarity with Marjorie Taylor Greene, or Brett Kavanaugh, or whatever right-wing Christian we can name, the judgment that God has placed upon them, I am bound with them in that judgment. For we are baptized under Christ. We can't escape it. And this is why, for me, I maintain this kind of strict, this is kind of sense of, no, we are not out of it yet. Like, it is good and important to be doing the work you're saying is happening, Tracy. I 100% agree. We must be doing that. But God's judgment is still, from my perspective, still falling upon our sisters and brothers in Christ who find themselves caught up in the demonic of this world, which we all are to a degree. I'm not trying to make a hard us and them comparison here. It's just that judgment, because of the inherent solidarity and corporateness of the body of Christ, we are all, from my perspective, under the same judgment. That's really where I stand on it.
Thank you, Tracy and John and Tracy. Are you guys from Bakersfield?
Yeah, we're from Bakersfield, California.
All of a sudden, I saw these Bakersfield guys or folks listening to my podcast, and so I wondered who they were. So it's really nice to meet you.
Yeah, John turned me on the podcast. He listened to it first and said I might like it. So yeah.
I listened to your book for about a week while I went on my daily walk. I listened to your book, and then the two of us, we get together. I retired last summer, and he's a pastor, so he never has anything to do anyway. So we get together pretty regular for lunch or for tea, and talk about what we're reading. And your podcast was really, I told him, I said, here's somebody who is thinking along the same lines as us, who has read a lot of the same materials that we have. And we really, it's a struggle when you go to a church where, Ethan, you just said something that I'm going to have to think about. When you talk about Madison Cawthorn, and you talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene, and you talk about, my heart does not leap to their defense, right? And so, but I live in a community and go to a church where the people in the congregation, I think Tracy would agree with me, spend more time listening to Fox News during the week than they do to his sermons. I mean, he's got them for an hour maybe, but they're listening to Fox News for 6 to 8 hours. What do you do, right? It's easy for me, right? I'm a layperson. I could just say, I heard one white woman's in a study like this that I was a part of on Esau McCauley's book, Reading While Black. And she said, I am so done with a white church. And she just started going to a black church, right? And there are times when I'm tempted to do exactly the same thing, to just find an AME church, right? And just do that. But that leaves poor Tracy by himself, right? What do you do when your people, right, are, as you put it, Ethan, you made me think about this differently. They're going through judgment, right? And they need to be awakened, and somebody said recently, and it made me think about this. They say, that was you, Conrad. You said the prayer in the garden, right? Couldn't you just stay awake with me a little longer, right? And I shared that with Tracy, and we spent one afternoon talking just about that passage, right? What does it mean to stay awake a little longer, right? And, this life is short enough as it is. God's going to take us all home at some point in time, right? Can't I just stay awake a little longer? Kind of, you really got me thinking about that. So look, I've appreciated everything that all of your students said, Conrad. This has been a delight this morning to participate in this, to be part of this conversation. But I'm really glad that you saved Ethan for the last, because this is really, it's the capstone. And these are the things that we're really wrestling with.
Thank you, John. Yeah, Maureen.
I just was impressed how you tripped over the description of yourself as from Charlottesville. I mean, that was the center of so much power and destruction and judgment, and I think the church was there were disciples there who witnessed to how things were wrong. I know Tracy Blackman from UCC is a real witness to that. And so you sound to me like the Jeremiah of Charlottesville, who is speaking the truth as you see it, but which reflects the reality. And as we know, the prophet's also supposed to build up as well. I think somebody mentioned that earlier. But I was wondering, that there's a neighborhood church movement. It was Tim Soren's and the Parish Collective. And one of the things that they keep saying is, where is God acting? And some of that sounded like what you were getting at, that we think that all the action is inside. And I think that's what the secular is. Where is God acting? And let's align with that. And so for me, that's the building up. And I mean, I hope the dismantling moves more rapidly, but I know, when I hear about these California groups here with Kevin McCarthy, I see that it's embarrassing to say you're a Christian in many circles. It's truly embarrassing, because I think that's the image that that people have really taken on. But anyway, this was great. I really appreciate. Do you write? Do you publish?
Maybe one day.
Okay.
As academic stuff maybe takes off, I don't know. But we'll see.
Yeah,
See
you
what
should.
happens.
You should.
There is a podcast interview that I did with Ethan on my YouTube channel, Maureen. So you go to my YouTube channel, and we chatted a year ago, maybe.
Yeah, just about.
And he is as dynamic then as he was today. And you can see why I set him down and said, but you're worth turning around here. You've got something within you. So thank you, Maureen. Anyone else? Yes, Marianne.
Sure. I think I'm listening with a different kind of ears on. are from a different context anyway than a number of people here. I come from Canada. And so our issues with racism aren't so very much focused on Black Lives Matter, but more our Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there, you know, we've had the TRC and the 94 calls to action, and some of them are directed to the church. And you know, we have a committee in our church that is focused now for several years, saying how do we enact the calls to action that are specifically directed to the church. And so we're doing this kind of thing, and we scratch our heads as we, you know, in years past looked across the border and saw Christians voting for Trump and couldn't figure that out. And so this marriage of the church to political power is not my current experience. And yet, I don't think just a divorce of the church and political power is the only answer either, because I'm seeing that in the secular world, like for example, the TRC or the creation care initiatives that are coming from outside of the church, we're saying yes. And how do we get on board with those? But it's really easy to lose focus on Jesus Christ and think that salvation comes from getting involved with creation care and getting involved with TRC calls to action. And so, you know, how do we avoid the pendulum swing to the other side, which is also a shameful discipleship, because it's looking for answers in as a community, but not the drift away from a Jesus focused community is also very strong. And I don't know, do you have anything to say to that? Because it's easy to sit back and say, sure, God's judgment on the church who's been totally aligned with political power. You'd have probably 99% of people in our congregation saying yes, yeah. But what do we do is we're still losing young people.
Sure. Well, and so for me, I really appreciate that question, Mary. Let me say an extra thing about me, and hopefully I will not babble and actually answer your question. I come from a generation, maybe the first generation of young people. I'm 31 now, so I'm an old person. But I come from the first generation of young people that do not remember a time when there were dozens and dozens of young people in a church. And so for me, the idea that, maybe I'll put it another way, I don't have a ton of anxiety personally over churches losing young people in general, right? Maybe I should have more anxiety. But for me, the sense I have is, because I view worldly activism and Christian and the engagement in the secular as part and partial to Christian discipleship and the sanctified life, I have a hard time drawing a distinction between, as you say, a Jesus-centered community and the sort of, using my language, the sort of shameful discipleship of, you know, that we might see on the other side of the pendulum, which is, oh, well, we're just making a community full of social activists, right? For me, I think that the risk is worth it. The risk that the church needs to take in divorcing itself from political power, and instead seeing itself as a mobile, flexible, I would say field hospital style church in the world. The risk of the drift towards a community of people that only does social activism, I think, is worth it. And the reason why I think it's worth it isn't because I think that, oh well, it's just better to, if we lose the community, if we lose Jesus from the community, as long as we're doing good things, we're fine. I don't really see it that way. But the reason why I think it's worth taking the risk now is because of the sheer amount of sin and evil that this wedding of the Christian church, at least in the United States, and right-wing political power has done. Like, I think that you're right. It's possible that the pendulum can swing very far the other way, and we should be mindful of that, and we should take care of that if it happens. But we really got to get the pendulum to swing, because currently, right now, from where I'm standing, the pendulum has not swung at all in this country. And in fact, it just keeps swinging to the right. From an institutional and sort of power broking perspective. We sometimes like to say, I'm in a religion department at the University of Virginia, so I study Christian theology, but in a religious studies department. And so many of my colleagues don't do theology or whatever. And sometimes I have a colleague that'll say, remember the Christian church is in decline in this country, and so it's really only a matter of time, before that kind of unholy marriage disintegrates. And I remind them, I'm like, even if it is only a matter of time, we can do a whole lot of bad shit, pardon my language, before that disintegrates. And also, I'm not entirely sure it's going to disintegrate, because even though religiosity among even evangelicals is down, the amount of people identifying as evangelicals is up. And so it actually doesn't matter that what that says to me is, it actually doesn't matter that the church's religious life is increasingly more and more unhealthy, according to these folks who are doing who kind of are imagining the Christian life as being politically inflected in this way, right? What instead matters more is this matrix of sort of Christian talking points and Christian theological justification of kind of social, political, and economic power. And so, long story short, Mary, I hear what you're saying, and I do agree, because I do want there to be a Jesus-centered community. But I think we need to be, at least in this country, willing to take the risk that the pendulum will swing too far in the other direction in order to get the pendulum to swing. Does that help?
Sure, kind of.
Sure.
I mean, I'm in a denomination that would be probably considered very evangelical.
Mm-hmm.
And as we move toward a more progressive, as our congregation moves toward a much more progressive stance, the warning that keeps getting tossed to us is that, oh, you're going to become the United Church of Canada, which closes X number of doors every week and is dying. And so you're going to become social activists only without the core, and that's going to fade away. And I do know that the Canadian context is different than the American context, and trying to figure out what does, for lack of a better term, what does non-shameful discipleship look like when we're already quite far down the road of what you desire, like what you're holding up as the place to get to. So our congregation would already be there in large part, I think, and it still feels like, yeah, we're just as lost as we were before.
Mm.
You're getting some discouragement on my part right now. But
I appreciate what you're saying. I'll say one more thing about that, Mary. This might, thanks again, Tracy. This might put me in a difficult camp to defend, but I really don't care if churches close. I really don't care. Like churches should feel free to close. I think the local church is really great, and I'm a big believer in its ability to make good disciples and really make their communities really good and strong. I really am. Like, I am a pastor, and so I think that's important. But when somebody says, and this is not, I don't mean to call you out in any way, Mary, but when folks say to me, or want to draw that to my attention and be like, okay, but these churches are still closing. My usual first thought is good. That's probably fine. It's probably fine if churches are closing. Mostly because, as John and other folks have said, not just here but in other places, it appears to be in and among church communities that a lot of kind of bad stuff happens anyway. In terms of radicalizations and stuff like that. And so from my perspective, when institutional power systems close, on one hand, we can say, oh, that might create a vacuum and now more people listen to Fox News. Or on the other hand, it might disrupt the power structures that cause people to have some of those things reinforced. And since I happen to think that the direction that God is leading the church into is one of dismantling and mobilization among the secular space, I think it makes sense that churches are going to close. And I think, I'm a United Methodist. I don't know who knows a ton about what's going on in the United Methodist Church right now, but it's pretty wild, and there's a new, more conservative Methodist denomination that is launched, and there's a very good chance that in 2024 the United Methodist Church will officially kind of split, and this is primarily about LGBTQ folks, but it's actually more about our theology of the Bible, which I'd love to talk more about another time. From my perspective, in the midst of all of this stuff that's happening, it's probably good that the United Methodist Church is going to close churches and lose institutional power. It's probably good. There were United Methodist pastors who were at January 6th in our country. And there were faithful United Methodists who attempted to murder Mike Pence. I don't know where they heard that. I'm sure they heard it, in many of the spaces that certain kinds of demonic propaganda are presented. But I also know that one of the places they probably heard it was at church. And so if churches need to close, that doesn't bother me at all. I don't mean to sound, as I said that, I sound like a real arrogant asshole. Pardon my French again. And I don't mean to sound that way. I'm just trying to speak from my perspective, but that's kind of my thought on that.
Rosie, are you going to say something?
Well, this entire discussion is calling to mind. A group of us in my congregation are part of an adult Sunday school class. We still have Sunday school, which has been studying the Marsh biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And this entire discussion seems so parallel to me to what Bonhoeffer experienced in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, of the dangerous political affiliation with the German church. And I guess what I would briefly bring forward here is Bonhoeffer's own evolution of thought from being integrated into that church as a young man, but eventually departing from it, starting the confessing church, starting his own communities, and starting something that was outside of that structure. So, the hope that brings me is that there are models for an alternative. Mm-hmm. Now, unfortunately, Bonhoeffer paid a price for it, but it was a price he was willing to pay. And, talking about what was the term? I mean, his term was costly discipleship as opposed to cheap grace. So, I mean, I know this is not new for all of us here who are students and scholars, but I guess that is one tidbit of hope, that there are models that have pushed back against that kind of political infiltration of the church.
I agree.
Ethan, why don't you share something that I'd like to respond?
Sure.
Go.
I was just going to say, one, I happened to TA for Charles Marsh at the University of Virginia,
Great.
and he's
Yay!
really good. He's really great. I'm glad you're reading that. I was just going to say, I agree. I think that faithful Christians should be considering alternative models for being together as God's church in really good and faithful ways. I don't see that though, and I don't think you're saying this either, Rosie. I don't see that though as an escaping of judgment. I see that as we Christians constantly asking the question, how can we be faithful in the midst of a fallen world?
Right.
And that is still one of the most important things we need to be asking ourselves, even as, you know, it seems to me anyway, that the church is, that God's judgment against the church, at least in this country, is heading towards an active stripping away of power, dismantling of systems, and the continued erosion of these maybe sociological factors that we see as being part and parcel to a healthy church. That young people are not in church, and are increasingly not in church. Not just the young people who've never been in church, that the church has never been good at reaching, but even the young people that the church maybe is a little better at reaching. That those young people are leaving is a sign of God's judgment on the church, and also a sign that the church is not a good place for young people right now. And maybe what it means to be faithful might mean that we need to consider what it means to have versions of Christian community that young people can be at, and be not only be faithfully present in, but to be good places for those young people. And so I think that's very worth it.
Rosie, do you want to respond anyway? Do you want to follow up though?
No, I take that. That's great. Thank you, Ethan.
Thank you.
I think earlier in the webinar, Tracy asked about the evangelical pietist stream that I'm discovering is behind Walter Brueggemann's life story, in which he would say he's never lost track of. And that stream of folks was also connected to the confessing church during the 30s and 40s. And before they became the UCC, or part of the UCC, they were deeply, in fact, Elmhurst College invited Bonhoeffer to take a position, and Elmhurst was the ENR church college, the Evangelical Reformed College, and Eden Seminary offered 3 honorary degrees to 3 of the confessing church pastors. So that was 1939. So they were already engaged and knew what was happening there. And so I think you're right, Rosie. I think there are alternative models. They're costly models. But I think I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you. Anyone else? Ken?
Yes, I might be the only person on this